Welcome again, and it's a great pleasure to introduce Bodo Winter, Professor of Linguistics at the University of Birmingham and UKRI Future Leaders Fellow. Is one of member of Advisory Board of Abstraction project. And after completing a master degree in general linguistics from the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and a PhD in cognitive and information science from the University of California. He worked as a researcher assistant at Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology. His research lies at the intersection of language, cognition, and multimodal communication, with a particular focus on iconicity, gesture, and numerical information transmission. Using a quantitative data-driven approach, he has contributed to the understanding of how language reflects and structures sensory experience, as explored in his book, Sensory Linguistics. For many years, he was the editor-in-chief of the Language and Cognition Journal and is currently leading of a UK government-funded project under the Future Leaders Fellowship Program, investigate how people interpret numerical data and visualization. Among his many publications, his book, Statistics for Linguistics, has become an essential research for those working with quantitative methods in linguistics. Today, he will talk about iconicity, words, and the limits of language. So I give you the floor.
Thank you so much. Shall I use this one? Yeah? Okay, perfect. So first of all, thank you for organizing this workshop and thank you for having me here today. I actually feel a little hesitant about my talk because it is somewhat tangentially related to some of the topics that have been discussed here today. It's going to be actually very concrete, not very abstract, because we're going to talk about how people talk about sensory information. But I think we'll see a lot of the themes that are being discussed today also in this. And Ricardo was talking about cognitive diversity, and it's good to have something different. So I will present a project where people talk about birdsong. And that seems very random in the topics, the other topics here today. But really, the point of this is that we'll see that how people talk about birdsong is one of the contexts which pushes language to its limit, because we have no vocabulary for doing this. And so then speakers use all sorts of creative semiotic strategies to overcome their limitations of language. And a lot of the dynamics that we see in there are also dynamics that are relevant for communicating concepts more generally. Okay, so before I start, I just want to briefly mention that the BIRD, in particular the BIRD project that I'll talk about today, is very much the joint work together with my colleague Marcus Perlman, who is at the University of Birmingham. Okay, so to set the stage, in my work, I'm very interested in how does language communicate and how do speakers communicate the things that they feel, the things that they taste, smell, hear, or see. So how does sensory information get packaged into language? And in my book, Sensory Linguistics, which is all about this topic, I distinguish between 5 different semiotic strategies that we can use to communicate sensory content to other people. To illustrate them with an example, let's say you're talking about an auditory concept, sound. What I mean by sensory words are things like loud, an adjective, or resounding, which single out a particular dimension of auditory experience. And it's a conventional term that everybody uses that sort of is a snapshot of auditory experience. But these are words that are specifically made for talking about sound. You can also, if you don't have a word that is specifically made for this, use other strategies. So for example, you can talk about an auditory impression by talking about the source of the auditory impression. So if I hear something, then I say, oh, it sounds like a squirrel. That tells you something about how it sounds like. Sometimes this can also be in a comparison. It doesn't actually have to be a squirrel, but I say it sounds like a squirrel. Some people have technical language available to them. So this is incorporating using a measurement system. So for example, if you know the hertz scale or frequency, then a 440 hertz sound is something that you can interpret. But for the rest of this talk, we're going to skip this technical language because I'm more interested in sort of the general vocabulary. And we use metaphor to talk about sensory impressions. So smooth melody is a metaphorical expression from the perspective that the word smooth, originally in its primary sense at least, is a textual term, and it's now being co-opted to refer to sound experience. Another example would be a rough sound, another touch word that is used to talk about sound. And then let's not forget that we can also use iconicity. So iconicity is when form resembles meaning. In the domain of sound, that is onomatopoeia. So we can say things like, it went like tack, 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 or beep, or bang, or quack, which are conventionalized onomatopoeic expressions. And these are different from the conventionalized sensory words like loud or resounding, which don't resemble their referent. Now, what's interesting to me then is the big picture of which strategies are used for which domains and which specific contexts make some strategies sort of more preferred and others make other strategies less preferred. And just to sneak in one aspect of conversational dynamics, so we have looked at iconicity in conversations and found that there's certain social contexts that heighten iconicity or heighten the use of iconicity. So just as a quick detour, for those of you who are not linguists might not have heard the term idiophones, which are marked words that depict sensory imagery. We have the person who had that definition in the room. And so, for example, in Korean, kwang kwang means bang, or tekul tekul means to roll. And these are words that stand out from the rest of words. So native speakers recognize them to be different from usual words. And they recognize them to have a depictive quality. That depictive quality may not necessarily be immediately obvious to you. It's not necessarily accessible to foreigners. But a Korean speaker will see tekul tekul as imitating a rolling motion. And so we got people into the lab to do a conversational task. The details of the task don't even matter because we found similar results across different tasks. But crucially, we had people talk either with a friend that they brought to the lab or with a professor. And what we found is that people use more idiophones in speaking to their friend than in speaking to their professor. So maybe in a more formal context, when you're talking to a professor, these highly iconic words, they might feel too playful or too childish perhaps, and therefore you're not using them as much. But it could also be the reverse, which is that when you're talking to friends, you want to use these fun words as a tool of engagement. And in another study on the same data set, we've looked at gesture, and gesture is also another way in which we can be iconic. So I can show you the size of something and the form resembles the meaning. And we found that people overall use more gesture when talking with their friends, but also specifically more iconic gesture. So for example, when they talk about motion, they will be more likely to encode the path of a motion, and they will less likely to do that when they're talking to a professor. So lowered iconicity. And that's just one example of how sort of iconicity varies as a function of what is the social context. Now, another very important factor is what is the domain of what you're talking about. So different domains will have different strategies. We talked yesterday at the dinner about wine. I'm not a wine taster. I don't know anything about wine. But what's been found when you talk about taste experiences is that people use the source-based strategy a lot. And that seems to be the dominant way of communicating tastes. So, for example, wine is described as fruity, which is talking about, it's using fruits as saying something about the wine, or vanilla, or muscat, all of which are terms of food items that are then related or compared to a wine. So in one paper, not all flavor expertise is equal, they found that 50% of novices, when given a wine, will use source-based language. So that's the dominant strategy, beats all the other strategies. But experts actually use more source-based strategies. So that really shows you that this is not only differing by domain, but also by expertise within domain. The different semiotic strategies get weighted differently. So let's briefly talk about smell before we get to the birds, because smell is a really interesting case of something that has been found to be lacking, specifically in the English language. So we have the word musky in English, which is one word that is arguably one of the most precise smell words or smell adjectives that we have. But if you look at the other smell words, they tend to be like aromatic, fragrant, odorous, stinky. Not really, they're actually very abstract. They're not really about a specific sensory experience as much as about how pleasant or unpleasant that experience is to you. And in some other work, I've shown that smell language in particular tends to be more positive and negative. It tends to have more of this evaluative quality, but be then less specific with respect to the actual sensory experience that's encoded. So the idea then is that because the English smell vocabulary is somehow lacking, we don't have a lot of terms that precisely identify smell, we have to use another semiotic strategy to make up for that. So there's this sort of trade-off between the strategies. So we can, for example, say it smells like a banana, which is more precise than saying it smells fragrant or something. And actually, in a paper published in Language and Cognition, Tom Poulton has asked people to give smell descriptions and found that 50% of those descriptions have source-based strategies. So that is a very common thing in both taste and smell. Now, briefly, I want to show you how metaphor too can be something that makes up for the lack of vocabulary. So if you don't have dedicated smell vocabulary, why can't I just use vocabulary from another domain and co-opt it for that? So here I'm briefly branching into a topic, and I will also we'll see this again with the birds, that is called linguistic synesthesia. Personally, I don't like the term synesthesia here, but this is the term that's now been established. Which goes back to Stephen Ullman, a linguist, who looked at which sensory words or which sensory vocabulary is used to describe other sensory vocabulary. So how do the senses combine? These are expressions like smooth melody, the one that I've shown you before, where there's a combination of two distinct senses. So what Stephen Ullman did is he constructed tables like this, reading texts like Lord Byron's, for example, like poetry, and then looked at which touch terms or how often are touch terms used to talk about sound or sight. So the way you read these tables is that, for example, that one over there is touch used to talk about sound. So the rows are the sources and the columns are the targets. You can then look at, for example, you can look at the row totals and you can see that touch is the target of one of these metaphors only 8 times, but it is used 121 times as the vocabulary that is used to talk about something else. So you can make a ratio of these two and you find that it has a really big ratio. So touch tends to lend its vocabulary. And in a recent study with Francesca Strick-Lievers, who's actually here, we're very excited about this. It's coming out very soon. We have looked at every single study that has been done on linguistic synesthesia since the 30s, actually, and compiled all this data into a meta-analysis of these synesthetic expressions. What you can then do is you can look at what is the source or target preference for different modalities. So each dot in here is a study. So I published a research study on linguistic synesthesia, so one of those tables. And to the left means that smell likes to attract vocabulary from other senses. To the right means it would be lending itself in that study to talk about, for example, it's a smelly sound or something like that. It doesn't happen very often. But here you can clearly see that smell is sort of borrowing vocabulary. It doesn't have a lot of vocabulary its own. That's what this graph shows. And that happens to be the case across languages. And so what we then see here is that both source-based language and metaphors are used as a way to make up for the lack of dedicated sensory vocabulary. Okay, so before we get to the birds, I just want to set the stage by looking at, because we're gonna in this talk, I'm gonna be focused on English. So it'll be really good to have an overview of what is the overall sensory composition of the English vocabulary. And this is something that I did together with Marcus Perlman and Asfar Majid in this paper, where we used established databases of words rated for modalities to look at both the type frequencies, so for what are there more words, as well as the token frequencies. And here I'm showing you from one of these databases all the adjectives that have one dominant modality according to rating data. So people had to rate these words for how much they are sensory, sight related or smell related. And what you can clearly see by the size of these bubbles is that smell amongst these adjectives makes only up 6% of the adjectives, so it doesn't have many adjectives, in contrast to sight, which is dominant here. So 50%, close to 50% of the adjectives are predominantly sight-related adjectives. And we can see that sound has quite a few words in this database, but also not as many as vision. So there's a clear sort of vision dominance. And then what we did in the studies, we also looked at token frequencies. So how often do people use these words in corpora? We looked at different corpora. Here I'm showing you just one corpus, but it doesn't really matter because you will find no matter what, that vision dominates, in particular smell. People don't verbalize smell experience very often. And that seems to suggest that for English speakers in our culture, where smell might not be regarded so highly, we don't verbalize these experiences very often. We don't have a lot of communicative need to do so. And then it makes sense that we don't actually have a big vocabulary because we don't need to make many differentiations there. But actually, even though sound comes second in the token frequencies, sight is still twice as likely. So people verbalize visual experiences more often than sound experiences or auditory experiences. So keep that in mind, because we can see here already that there might not be that many words, and we don't often get into a context in which we have to talk about the details of auditory experiences. And so this was for smell. Now that we're going to talk about the birds, finally, this is an auditory object, something that you might not notice much. Like a lot of people are very woefully unaware of how much beautiful birdsong there is. We just listened to one that we couldn't identify in the coffee break. While I walked to the university here, I was able to hear 5 different bird species. So it's constantly around, but we don't care as much. Now, a few people care, but most people don't. So language doesn't have a dedicated bird description vocabulary. But there are contexts when you really do care, when you're a birder, where you want to teach somebody else, this is this bird, and that's that bird. And then you might ask, okay, but how do I actually distinguish them? And then you need to find words to describe this. And so that is a context that is quite unusual. So let's just imagine how this works for one bird, the goldfinch. That's my favorite British bird. I can hear it every day on the square next to me. Cardellino, is that how it's called here? Okay. 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 But I mean, so we can talk about let's have a discussion about this later. Okay, but I want you to listen to this beautiful bird just for a couple seconds. Okay, one more time I'm going to ask you to listen to this, but now I ask you to imagine writing a book where you have to tell somebody how this bird sounds like so that they can read the book and get some idea that this is what I should have in my auditory mind, my auditory imagery, as well as distinguish it from other birds. Yeah, just imagine what words you might use. So I hope you can appreciate that this is probably quite hard. Yeah, it's not easy. It's a very unfamiliar alien insect sounding object. How do you actually describe this? So let's actually look at some field guides. So these are these books that birders use to learn about birds, because this is where the data for this analysis comes from. So we, as I'll show you in a second, have different field guides. So here is how one author described it: a delightful liquid twittering tiwit, or various rapid tinkling canary-like trills and chirpings, tweet, sweet, 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 or a sharp didilit call, prolonged tinkling jingle of a song. These were three descriptions from three different field guides of the goldfinch song. So what we did in this analysis is we transcribed bird field guides. And in fact, actually, these are the field guides in my old, not so slightly dirty floor on my flat. And we have 18 field guides, 7,000 descriptions, so 7,000 entries that describe a bird call from 2,500 bird species. So that's about, so there's 10,000 bird species, we think, so that's about 25% of the world's bird species we cover. And we have 160,000 tokens in this corpus. It's a fairly small corpus, but it's a very dedicated corpus where every word really matters and is dedicated to the description of sound. Just as a quick aside, if you wanted to trace my analysis for all this talk, all the data and code, you can download it and have a look at it yourself. Okay, so what we're going to do with this data now is we're going to look at how the source-based strategy, metaphors, and iconicity get combined to solve this difficult task of having to communicate this. I'm going to focus in order on the source-based strategy, iconicity then second, and then we're going to finish with metaphor. Okay, so the source-based strategy, I will call it for now comparisons, because really what is happening here is comparisons, as you see. I went through so far 1,000 random entries, which were annotated for specific syntax that introduces a comparison. So things like sounds like, resembles, and so on. And doing that yields that 36% of entries have a syntactically explicit comparison. So to give you an example, the yellow-green vireo is described as a song similar to Red-Eyed, so the Red-Eyed vireo, but shorter, less musical and delivered more rapidly, averaging one phrase every 1.5 seconds. Overall impression very similar to house sparrow chirping. Also annotated this data to what is it being compared to, because that's interesting. And it turns out that this one is to a similar bird. By similar, I mean it's in the same genus, so it's also a vireo. And that is actually the dominant category. So birds are mostly compared to other birds, and that's 47% of them, but specifically to birds within close taxonomic distance. Yeah. You have less often comparisons to other birds, which is only 15% of the time. You have also things like this. The tanager here is described as having a vireo-like, which is to another bird category. So this is not just to a specific bird, but to a category of birds, the vireos. What's so interesting about this is that these comparisons aren't really directly for just communicating what is the auditory impression, but they're really about learning about making distinctions amongst different types of birds. And you can see this because this is a qualified comparisons, I like to call them, because it's also telling you what are the dimensions of difference to another bird. So these are the similar to but softer type of constructions. And if you look at specifically those, the ones that do make a qualified comparison, 80% of those are to similar birds. So you can see that the purpose of these comparison constructions is to make fine-grained distinctions and learn the differentiation among specifically songbirds. And actually, as a quick note on this, both of these were songbirds, yeah. And there's some interesting connection between this work and cognitive anthropological research of how people classify and think about birds. These are passeriforms, which is the order of songbirds, and that tends to be about 50% of all birds on the planet are songbirds. They're the dominant category. And in our data, they're also 50% of all entries. But what's interesting is that there's 60% of all comparisons. And when you have qualified comparisons, even more than that. So you can see that these comparisons are specifically for learning about the fine-grained distinctions amongst the songbirds. And what's so fascinating about this is that independently of this, on purely visual characteristics, not on sound, anthropological research tells us that songbirds are our prototype of birds. So they are the sort of like quintessential bird. When you ask people, list me a bird, most of the time they mention the robin first, which is a songbird. What you see here is that this also pans out in these vocalization descriptions, in the sense that they're the hardest to distinguish amongst each other, but there are so many similar other ones that this similarity structure is what makes them sort of stand out from the rest. Okay, so that's the comparisons, but let's talk about iconicity, which is really where my heart is at. What's really cool about this corpus is that you don't need to classify words as iconic or not as the researcher, which is always a difficult thing to do, because the onomatopoeias are typographically highlighted for you by the authors. They are usually in italics or in boldface. There's some highlighting typographically that makes them stand out from the rest. And that's really important because it tells you to read these words differently. I want to also say that these comparisons that you've just seen actually a lot of the times are combined with onomatopoeias. So a shrill turn-like, which is the comparison, kjörk kjörk, or analogous to the henk of the snow goose. And it turns out that 50% of the comparisons actually contain an onomatopoeia, which really shows you that onomatopoeia is the main game in this corpus. Okay, let's focus briefly on these onomatopoeias. So we can pull them out automatically. These are the most frequent ones. Chip is the most frequent one. And there are a total of 11,000 of such orthographically marked onomatopoeias. So given that we only had 6,000 some entries, you can see that most of the entries contain at least 2 onomatopoeias. But they come in various stages of wildness or tameness, depending on how much they're integrated into the linguistic system. I'm going to skip some of this, but I will make you listen to very quickly the seagull screeching championship. So this is the far end of sort of wild onomatopoeia, where you really see everything that your vocal apparatus can do without linguistic constraints being used. And that's pure vocal mimicry. But then on the other end of this spectrum, you have in our corpus, so of course we don't have these in our corpus, but we have things like quack, which is fully part of the system because you can inflect it, it's integrated into the grammar, it's like a normal word. But then you have various stages. So for example, squawk and warble are phonologically unusual and therefore stand out a bit more. Croup is in italics, so it's highlighted. You can have letter replication to make it more expressive. And then you can even have things that are not even viable words. So Zwiet, or even then these full, long, sort of very expressive phrases. And you can see different stages of sort of how expressive these onomatopoeias are and how much they're integrated into the system. We have analysis on this that I'm going to skip over because that's not the main part of the talk. But why this is relevant is that if you're looking at not just the typographically marked onomatopoeias, but you're also looking at the ones that are integrated, then actually this number changes to 93%. And how did I do this? We have iconicity ratings, which help us make a decision about which ones of these other words might be taken to be iconic. And so you can really see that once you open up to these less marked ones, then this corpus is filled with onomatopoeia, which tells you that it's probably communicatively efficient and useful to use it here. Okay, so that's iconicity. Let's look at metaphor. What I did is in these descriptions, you went through this manually and deleted every word that is not related to the description of sound. So for example, on a high perch, it's sung from a high perch, is a it's something about where the bird sings from. It's not about the quality of the sound. So I basically deleted every word that is related to this, and then looked at the remaining words, the content words, and classified them. So amongst these, you have words like nasal, ventriloquial, sneezing, or throaty. And of course, it's not actually that the bird produces a sound through the nose. These are actually metaphorical in the sense that they're human descriptions of the human voice. This is how a human voice would sound like, and we transfer that quality over to the bird song. And 16% of entries contain one of these terms. There are also emotional metaphors where you have a lonely song, a sorrowful, a mourning, or lazy tune. And these are words that are, it's not that the bird is actually lazy or actually mourning, but it's how a human voice would sound like if it was mourning, and that is the quality that's transferred to the sound. Then we have spatial words being used to talk about sound. That's very common. That's conventionalized in English. High-pitched, falling, hollow, deep. These are words that primarily have a spatial meaning and now have a conventionalized auditory meaning. And then we have these linguistic synesthesias again. So sight is interestingly not so common here. There's some interesting work by music psychologists which shows that sight metaphors are used more in instrument descriptions. It seems that maybe the birder community doesn't rely so much on sight. But that will be, for example, the word bright, a bright tune. Taste is very infrequent here, and it's actually only the word sweet. It's always like, this is a sweet tune, this is a sweet song. So it's really only about the like, does it sound nice? But what's really dominant here, and that's of all the other senses, the most dominant one is touch. So we have a sharp sound, a soft sound, a smooth sound, a hard sound. All of these are used to talk about birdsong. And these are the linguistic synesthesias. And here I'm going to briefly branch into the meta-analysis again that we did, because it's really interesting that when we look at across these different languages in our meta-analysis, which senses get combined with which, that touch tends to be the one that is has the highest lending capacity. So it lends its vocabulary to the other senses. And that's actually the case in every single study in this meta-analysis. And that's very different from sound, which has the highest attracting vocabulary capacity. So that is a suggestion that, well, actually, the sound vocabulary might be a little bit impoverished, and therefore you're using the touch vocabulary specifically to refer to that. Okay, so if we then take any of these metaphorical expressions, 63% of all entries contain at least one of them. Yeah. And so this actually completes the picture of these different semiotic strategies for this corpus. We can see that iconicity is the one that is almost always there. Metaphors come second, and comparisons comes third, although I would say the comparisons are not as much about the quality of the sound as learning distinctions. Okay, I briefly want to now zoom out of this and conclude by relating this to some, like you might say, okay, all of this is just bird language. How does this actually, what does this say about language in general? So one point I want to make that I think is really interesting is these two strategies work in tandem. So onomatopoeias, 75% are preceded by an adjective which is often metaphorical. So for example, a sharp or a crisp or a rough shiffity shiff. And there's this interesting division of labor where the adjective seems to tell you the timbre or the tonal quality that, of course, in writing you cannot do. If you're not imitating vocally, you cannot actually give you a rendition of this. So you have to use some descriptor. But it's interesting that this combination is so often in this corpus, and it seems to suggest that it's really communicating efficiently something. And so there's this really cool paper from 1975, Why Metaphors Are Necessary and Not Just Nice, by Andrew Ortony. And in it, he comes up with 3 different reasons for why people might use metaphor. He says that people might use metaphor because it communicates something very compactly. If I say, for example, Katarina is a soldier, then this expression in a very compact way communicates a lot of different features that if you wanted to describe them or paraphrase them would take you much more time. He also says that metaphor helps you to overcome the inexpressible. And there's some experimental evidence also by Andrew Ottoni that shows that things that are hard to talk about use more metaphor. And the vividness hypothesis, which is that metaphor gives you a very vivid description of what you're talking about. And so granted that we accept that Andrew Ottoni is right and metaphors satisfy all of this, I think in this corpus we can really say that iconicity does actually the same work. It overcomes the inexpressible in a very compact way. Try communicating the details of the contour of a sound without onomatopoeia, and you'll have to use many words to describe it. But also it gives you a lot of analog vivid detail. So if we now zoom out and think about the limits of language, what does this inform or say about how we overcome the ineffable? There's this really cool paper by Stephen Levison and Asfar Majid, the differential ineffability and the senses, where they talk about sort of which sensory information is harder or easier to talk about. And they define ineffability as the difficulty or impossibility of putting certain experiences into words. And given what we've seen in this corpus, I want to take issue with the word because the ineffability literature, the people who worry about what cannot be expressed, they're always concerned about language as a set of words or set of verbal strategies. There's this interesting paper by a philosopher, Sebastian Gabb, who actually complains about this and says, well, what does it mean when I tell you that something cannot be said? Obviously, this depends on what it means to say something. And actually what that means is that thinking about what cannot be said is tantamount to having a view or like of language. And so in this, you could say you cannot talk about birdsong because there are no words that are dedicated specifically for that. You have to sort of use these other strategies. And you could then say, okay, maybe metaphor and maybe the source-based strategy, they're part of language, and therefore maybe that overcomes the ineffability. But what's often forgotten is that these imitations, these iconic new words that are being created, if you see those as part of the language system as well, sound looks from being very ineffable, all of a sudden becomes super effable because you have the power of iconicity to very directly communicate it. So going back to this view, one view is to say all of these overcome the ineffability of not having sensory words. But the other way to think about this is maybe we haven't evolved a vocabulary of auditory terms, not just because of the communicative need of not having to express it as much, but also because we have such a powerful tool available where we can always readily make up a new word, a new imitation on the fly, and therefore we don't need to evolve a vocabulary that actually is dedicated to this. So you can see how sort of our view of whether we take these vocal imitations to be part of language, and traditionally they weren't as much thought of part of language, if we now put them into it, and they're clearly part of the system, then what is effable or what is ineffable really sort of shifts. And that concludes my talk. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Okay, we have time for 1 or 2 questions, maybe. Okay.
Want to extend this analysis not just for the sensory norming study, but also valence? If you think that sounds can be particularly, or I don't have words to describe it, as you may, placeable or not, and maybe it's the same for birds.
Oh, yeah. So there's some. So I think valence is, in general, when it comes to sensory stuff, a super important dimension. And in fact, actually, I've argued in linguistic synesthesia that one of the reasons, for example, why we might use taste and smell words so much is because of their valence. Like you say sweet sound because sweet is about pleasantness, and that's where we experience this in taste. Now, it is the case that birdsong in general is considered to be very pleasant. There's a lot of research showing that birdsong relaxes you. People like birdsong. So it could be, and so in a way, it could be that maybe while there's so much songbird stuff, while that is so overrepresented in this corpus, that might be an alternative reason for that. It would be interesting to see whether birdsong that people like or birdsong that people don't like is described differently. So that would be an interesting thing to do. But I mean, the issue here with this work so far is that we're only looking at the reflections of the sounds. We're not having the actual sounds, which is the next step where we'll then actually collaborate with ornithologists to then see which acoustic aspects correspond to which descriptions. Yeah. Yeah. Over there seems to be a cluster of people. Okay, yeah, over there.
Yeah, thank you very much for the nice talk. And I think I've learned quite a lot about bird songs. But I'm convinced. But my question is whether you can generalize this data to something else, because what you are doing and analyzing is just one function of language, which is describing things, right? So I'm going a bit into my field, actually. Yeah. So what about when you use those words to request things, or you request an object with an adjective, or you warn someone to do that, because you can use the same sentence to do different function in language. And actually language is not only describing, at least, I mean, if one believes the classical philosophical language, but what about other communicative functions? Do you think you could find similar results, or do you think you can generalize the data you have to other function of language, since we are speaking also a bit of communication? Yeah, thank you. Well, the typical things I do is this difference between describing and requesting, or naming and requesting. So you can use the same words. You had a word, for example, khaki, and you can say khaki to name it and describe it, the color, or describe or bring the attention to the khaki, but you can also say khaki to request a khaki, okay? Yeah. So you could say something like the stinky cheese, I don't know, and then you can say it for requesting or naming it, or I don't know, warning someone that the cheese is stinky, I don't know, something like this, but you use the same label, the same construction and the same thing. So because now it's about describing, and I think it's easy because you have those description from the books, but now is the question, well, what about when we use them for other actions?
So I think that's an excellent question that I will, I have not thought, like I'm going to be very honest with you and say that I haven't actually thought much about communicative function here. I've treated it as a description task. I think in the context of this particular work, it's actually justifiable because the birders are interested primarily in identification. So they want to identify the bird, and they want to have a description that is sufficiently detailed enough to identify it. So that is the communicative purpose, the stated purpose of these descriptions. What else then happens? I have no idea. So I'm not saying that this is I hear you, which is to say, the limitation of this is to say it is one specific communicative context that I'm modeling, and within that I show these patterns. One thing I would say is that we're currently doing work with, we have a PhD student, Jessica Bale. She's doing work where she's doing using this data that we have in an experimental fashion, which is still description, but it gets us closer to what we're doing is which descriptions help you best at identifying. So we're doing a task where we have onomatopoeias versus descriptions, metaphorical or source-based, and then looking at what of these strategies helps you best at identifying. But we are only modeling the identifying context here. I'm not sure, and I haven't done any work on the conversations of birders to see what sort of other communicative functions might play a role. Yeah.
Super cool talk, Bodo. I'm really excited to see your new work. But my question in a certain way dovetails with the previous question, which is, have you thought of also doing production experiments where you can have people with different experience of birding producing, but also you can actually directly manipulate the communicative context in which they're producing these things.
Oh, yeah.
So yeah, they might play games with each other where you just need to discriminate two different birds. You might vary how similar they are, but also they could be doing other sort of tasks like, I don't know, make the other rate the description as high as possible in how good it is or how funny it is and stuff like that.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that same student, she's doing both a prediction and a perception experiment, so this is early stages. We're still in the design phase, so we don't have the data yet. But what we're doing is we're having we want to target birders. We want to target novices who don't know anything about bird. And then we have the field guide descriptions. And we'll take some of the bird calls from like a subset of those and ask people to produce descriptions thereof. And then compare it between the novices and the experts. And one of the things that we've been thinking about is giving people constraints in this task. So for example, you're not allowed to use imitation. Or you have to use an imitation. And then the idea would be that this would allow us to sort of actually probe the communicative efficiency of some of these tools. So for example, maybe if you're not using imitation, then you're having much more verbose descriptions later. But yeah, I can see by both of these questions that I don't have a sufficient concern, I guess, with the communicative function of these. So it's very much sort of focused on this as a text so far. Yeah.
For the great talk, and yeah, very interesting, exciting. I have a question. I don't know whether I'm able to formulate it well. So you said that iconicity can help to make the ineffable become effable, right? My question pertains to the domain. You say that birds, so that people are interested in classifying birds. Yeah. But birds have characteristics that are stable. Let me say they are rather, or are there, distinctions between bird can be considered as rather stable, so genetically driven or something like that. Rather stable.
And they sing differently in cities or in the countries side.
Okay, that was my question. So how about a domain where this stability is, so you know what I mean? Here there is a domain that to me it was stable, but you say it is, there is not this big stability, but it could be that this need to make the ineffable effable is influenced by the stability of the domain you want to classify. That's a question. I don't know whether.
That's a great question. So yes, so birds do sing differently depending on where they are. So they because they learn from each other. Songbirds in particular, not so much the sort of contact calls and alarm calls. They tend to be stable. That would be an interesting, like you could then within the corpus look at this.
Thanks for this. Very, very cool work. So if I were a very reductionist biologist, I would actually look at those wonderful onomatopoeic patterns that you find and say, well, actually, that's just their own language. You know, what ornithologists and ethologists do when studying bird song is they look at bouts, they try to identify motifs, repetition, syllable structures, note sequences, and so on. And so if I were a reductive biologist, I would actually, look at those onomatopoeic patterns that you find yourself, and I would write, I don't know, a PNAS paper saying, linguistic laws of onomatopoeia in human language. My question is, how did you deal with this kind of data? So for instance, you mentioned you found 11,000 of them. Was there any segmentation involved before you counted, or that's just the expressions together?
That's the entire expression.
And then you had this nice word cloud, but it seemed to show only the monosyllables, or
yeah, that's because that's just because the monosyllables are more frequent.
Okay.
So the less frequent onomatopoeias, they just don't occur on the word cloud. Yeah.
But so I was interested in kind of more the inner linguistics of this little, because I do think that you could call this some kind of a sub-language for this particular community, right? Is that how you think about it too?
Yeah. Okay, very cool. So a couple things on this. I think, yes, it is a conventionalized, it's a community, and it's a community that has a long history. So people have been describing birdsong for a long time, and they are using past descriptions as well. So there's some sort of cultural transmission. Like everybody who's a birder will have read a bird book by somebody else at the time. And that means that this is a sort of dialect of sorts, or a particular community. There are very few words, however, that are unique to this. So one of the few ones that I can mention is upslurred. Upslurred comes up in this corpus a ton, and you would never find this outside of bird language, not very often. Most of the other words are general words, and we find similar patterns to, for example, the meta-analysis with the touch vocabulary. When it comes to the onomatopoeias, we have so much work to do in terms of annotating them for syllables, phonological structure, and so on. But it would be really interesting to see, and that relates to your question, how much you can reconstruct the relations between birds from the onomatopoeia. So looking at the natural world filtered through, this is the representation of it in onomatopoeia, and what gets lost, like which species that are actually distinct get lumped together, and which ones are actually different. That's one of the things that we want to do in the future. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Bodo.